I was just a child the first time I heard whispers of the schools. Not schools like the one I went to, filled with bright windows and chalk-dusted blackboards, but ones buried under silence, surrounded by fences, and filled with fear. Back then, no one told us the truth. Not about the classrooms, not about the cries, not about the children who never came home. This isn't just history. It's a wound. One that still bleeds beneath Canada's polished image of peace and progress. For more than a century, Canada operated a system designed not to educate, but to erase. A system built to strip Indigenous children of their language, their culture, their very identities. Residential schools, over 130 of them, scattered across provinces, hidden in plain sight, funded by the government and run by churches. Beginning in the late 1800s, Indigenous families across the country were torn apart. Children as young as 4 were taken from their homes, sometimes by force, sometimes under threat of arrest, transported hundreds of miles to institutions that promised civilization. What they found instead were cold dormitories, cruel punishments, and the constant echo of a world they were told to forget. The government called it assimilation. Survivors called it something else: genocide. Inside these walls, children were beaten for speaking their native languages. Their hair was cut, their names replaced with numbers, their stories rewritten. Brothers and sisters were separated. Letters home were censored. Loneliness and fear became constant companions. Some children died of disease, others died from neglect, and some simply vanished. For years, these truths remained buried, held down by shame, denial, and silence. The mainstream narrative spoke of progress, not pain, of unity, not cultural destruction. But the survivors never forgot. They carried the weight of memory on their backs like heavy blankets, each one woven with names, faces, and voices that refused to fade. Then came the reckoning. In the 1990s, the first cracks began to appear. Survivors, now grown, began to speak out. Lawsuits were filed. Protests were held. And slowly, the country started to listen. The stories that emerged were harrowing accounts of sexual abuse, starvation, forced labor, and psychological torment. One after another, survivors stood before courts, commissions, and the Canadian public, bearing their scars. It was no longer possible to look away. In 2008, the Canadian government issued a formal apology. Prime Minister Stephen Harper stood before Parliament and acknowledged the damage done. But words alone could never be enough, not when thousands of children never made it home, not when their families were still searching for answers. Then, in 2021, the world was forced to face the haunting legacy once more. At a former residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia, a ground-penetrating radar uncovered the unmarked graves of 215 children. The nation stood still. Candles were lit, shoes were laid on church steps, and the question on everyone's lips was simple, painful, and urgent. How many more? This wasn't an isolated discovery. Soon, similar grave sites were uncovered at other schools: Marieval, Cranbrook, Penelakut Island. The numbers rose into the thousands. These were not just statistics. These were children, each with a name, a family, a future, stolen. Canada could no longer claim ignorance. But the full truth of this tragedy doesn't lie only in government records or church archives. It lives in the voices of those who survived, in the songs sung quietly in the dark, in the stories passed from grandparent to child, in the resilience of communities still healing, still searching. What kind of nation does it take to look at its own past and not flinch? What kind of courage does it require to unearth the secrets buried beneath schoolyards? And what will we discover if we keep digging, if we truly listen to the voices the country tried so hard to silence? Because in the heart of this story is a truth still waiting to be told. To truly understand the cruelty of the residential school system, we must go inside, not into a generic institution, but into one of its darkest corners, a place whose name still echoes with pain: St. Anne's Residential School in Fort Albany, Ontario. To the Canadian government and church authorities, it was just another part of the system, a school among many. But to the children who entered its doors, St. Anne's became a place of torment, experimentation, and fear. Its legacy, unlike most, came with documentation, because even the most horrific acts sometimes leave a paper trail. The school operated from 1902 to 1976. Run initially by the Catholic Church and later by the federal government, St. Anne's held hundreds of Indigenous children, many from remote Cree and Ojibwe communities. Most were taken without consent. Once inside, their lives were no longer their own. Survivors speak of relentless abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual. But St. Anne's was unique in one chilling way. It had a homemade electric chair. Let that settle in. A chair built in the basement of a school used to shock children for discipline or entertainment. Survivors described how staff would strap kids in, sometimes forcing others to watch. The pain was unbearable. Some fainted. Some screamed. Others simply shut down. Their bodies jolted. Their trust shattered. Their childhood stolen in flashes of current. Years later, government investigators would uncover references to the device in archived documents. They confirmed its existence. But accountability? That was harder to find. The torment didn't stop at electricity. Children at St. Anne's were often punished for speaking their native languages, Ojibwe or Cree. They were beaten with sticks, forced to eat soap, or locked in dark rooms for hours. Food was scarce, and what they received was often rotten. Medical care was minimal. Emotional care? Non-existent. One survivor, Edmund Metatawabin, would later write in searing detail about his time there. In his memoir, Up Ghost River, he recalled the constant fear of priests, nuns, even the other students. Abuse created a hierarchy: those who had been broken and those who broke others to survive. Some children tried to escape. They ran into the forests, barefoot and freezing. Some were caught, beaten, returned. Others never made it back. The trauma followed them long after the school closed. Nightmares, addiction, suicide, generational pain passed down like a curse. Some survivors never told their stories, too ashamed, too haunted. Others, like Metatawabin, became warriors for truth. They pushed for justice, for compensation, for recognition. But the road was steep, and the wounds ran deep. In the early 2000s, the government launched the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, one of the largest class action settlements in Canadian history. As part of it, survivors from St. Anne's were supposed to receive compensation. But many soon realized the government had withheld key documents records detailing abuse, staff investigations, internal reports. Without those files, claims were denied. Truth was denied. So the survivors fought back. They took their case to court. They held press conferences. They told their stories again and again, each time reopening the pain, because they knew silence would only protect the abusers. In 2021, new documents were finally released. They confirmed what survivors had been saying for decades, that the abuse at St. Anne's was systematic, deliberate, and covered up. Yet few of the perpetrators were ever held accountable. Think about that. A school where children were electrocuted, where predators operated with impunity, where the state knew and did little. And today, the burden of proof still falls on the victims. St. Anne's is not just a symbol of residential schools, it is a mirror reflecting the darkest truths of colonialism. It reminds us that atrocities don't just happen in distant lands or distant times. They happen here, in our backyards, behind the walls we were told to trust. But how did such a system grow so vast, so accepted, so institutionalized? Who built it? Who funded it? Who looked the other way? Long before the first electric shock was delivered in the basement of St. Anne's, the groundwork had already been laid, not by mistake, not by negligence, but by design. The residential school system was not an accident of policy. It was the policy. It began with a vision, a colonial dream rooted in control. In the eyes of 19th-century Canadian leaders, Indigenous people were not citizens of a shared nation. They were seen as obstacles, barriers to expansion, savages to be civilized. And for those in power, the solution wasn't just territorial, it was spiritual, cultural, and generational. To change the future, they would start with the children. The 1876 Indian Act was the cornerstone, a sweeping piece of legislation that gave the Canadian government legal control over almost every aspect of Indigenous life. Land, governance, identity. It redefined who was Indian and how they were allowed to live. And among its tools for assimilation was education, or rather, the weaponization of it. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, the so-called Father of Confederation, made it clear Indigenous children needed to be removed from their families. In his own words, if you take the savage out of the family, you save the child. It was never about education. It was about erasure. Churches were brought in to help execute the plan: Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian. Each took on the administration of dozens of schools, funded by the government, driven by missionary zeal. Together, they created a nationwide network designed to dismantle Indigenous culture, one child at a time. By the early 1900s, residential schools were everywhere, over 130 across Canada, most located far from the communities they targeted, making visits from parents nearly impossible. Children as young as 4 were taken sometimes forcibly by police, other times under threat of jail or revoked welfare payments. Once inside, the indoctrination began. Hair was cut, traditional clothes replaced, names were stripped away and replaced with numbers or Christian names. Ojibwe, Cree, Dean, Inuktitut, these languages were forbidden. If a child spoke them, they were beaten, isolated, humiliated. The message was clear. Who you are is wrong. What you believe is wrong. Where you come from is wrong. The curriculum was minimal, often ending at grade 5 or 6. Boys were trained for manual labor farming, carpentry. Girls were taught domestic skills, cooking, cleaning, sewing. Very few went on to higher education. They weren't meant to. The goal was not to empower, it was to control, to break the bond between child and culture, between future and past. And behind the lessons, there was cruelty. Teachers who doubled as abusers, priests who preyed on the vulnerable, discipline that blurred into sadism, hunger as punishment, isolation as control. It was, as many have since called it, cultural genocide. But for decades, the system operated without challenge. Complaints were buried, reports ignored, survivors silenced, even as evidence piled up accounts of death, abuse, disappearances. The machinery of assimilation kept turning, because behind every school was a network of politicians, bureaucrats, and religious leaders who benefited from looking the other way. And the effects weren't just inside the schools. Children who survived often returned home as strangers to families who didn't understand what they'd been through, or who were grieving the loss of children who never came back. The intergenerational trauma rippled outward, fueling cycles of addiction, abuse, broken trust, and society, instead of offering help, offered judgment. But perhaps the most haunting part of all, the unmarked graves. As survivors began to speak publicly in the 1990s and 2000s, a horrifying truth emerged. Many children had died in these schools, some from disease, others from neglect, accidents, even violence. And most were buried without ceremony, without markers, without records. In some cases, families were never even notified. They simply disappeared. Which raises the question, how many children are still missing? How many were lost beneath the surface of official reports and sanitized histories? The machinery of assimilation may no longer operate as it once did, but its legacy still lingers in every missing name, every broken family, every community still piecing itself back together. For decades, the truth lived in whispers. Survivors carried their memories like scars, some hidden, some too painful to speak aloud. They were told to move on, that it was in the past, that no one wanted to hear about the dark hallways, the stolen languages, the empty chairs at kitchen tables. But silence is not the same as healing. And one by one, voices began to rise. It started in living rooms, at kitchen tables, during long drives across reserves and northern highways. Survivors began to tell their stories to family members, to support workers, to anyone who would listen. And as more stories emerged, they revealed a horrifying consistency. These weren't isolated incidents. They weren't rare abuses. They were systemic. Still, the country didn't want to listen. Then came Phil Fontaine. In 1990, Fontaine, then Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, publicly spoke about the sexual abuse he suffered at Fort Alexander Residential School. It was a watershed moment, a respected national leader putting voice to the pain so many carried silently. Others followed. Stories emerged in newspapers, on television, in the chambers of Parliament. And then, something extraordinary happened. Survivors sued. Lawsuits piled up against the churches, the Canadian government, the administrators. Tens of thousands of former students joined class action claims. And for the first time in Canadian history, a government was forced to answer for a century-long policy of cultural destruction. The result? The 2007 Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history. It wasn't just about money, it was about acknowledgement. As part of the agreement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2008. Its mission? To document the stories, to record the damage, to offer survivors a platform not just to be heard, but to be believed. For 6 years, the TRC traveled across the country hosting public hearings, gathering testimony, holding space for grief. Over 6,700 survivors came forward. Some trembled as they spoke. Others wept. Some were stoic. Many had waited decades to tell their truth. They spoke of hunger, of being so starved they stole food from garbage bins. They spoke of violence, of being strapped, beaten, and locked in dark closets for speaking their language. They spoke of isolation, of being torn from their families, never learning how to parent because they themselves had never been parented with love. They spoke of classmates who never made it home. And through these stories, a new narrative was written, not one of national pride, but of national reckoning. In 2015, the TRC released its final report. Over 4,000 pages, 94 calls to action. It did not mince words. What happened in residential schools was cultural genocide. The report outlined not only what was done, but what needed to be done. It called for curriculum changes, funding for language revitalization, justice for missing children, and full implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But reports don't change systems. People do. And while some calls to action have seen progress, many remain unfulfilled. Promises delayed. Apologies made, but not always backed by meaningful change. Yet the survivors kept pushing. In 2021, the world was shaken by news from Kamloops, British Columbia. Ground-penetrating radar had located the remains of 215 children buried in unmarked graves at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. It wasn't the first discovery, but it was the first time the broader Canadian public seemed to truly grasp the horror. Suddenly, residential schools were back in the headlines. Vigils formed, statues toppled, flags lowered, questions reignited. How many more graves are there? How could this have happened in a country that prides itself on peace, justice, and multiculturalism? And most painfully, what now? How does a country heal from wounds that span generations? How does it reckon with a legacy where the very institutions that were meant to educate, instead erased, brutalized, and buried? The answer is not simple. Reconciliation is not a single gesture, a one-time apology, or a national holiday. It is a journey, slow, painful, and deeply personal for those who lived the trauma. After the discovery in Kamloops, the world's eyes turned toward Canada. More than 1,800 unmarked graves have since been identified across multiple former residential school sites, and that number keeps growing. These are not just historical footnotes. They are children. They were once held, loved, and lost, often without answers, without ceremony. The grief is raw, but so is the demand for action. In 2008, then Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued a formal apology on behalf of the Canadian government. "We are sorry," he said. "The burden is not yours to carry alone." It was a moment that survivors had waited a lifetime for. But words, no matter how sincere, cannot undo a century of policies designed to erase Indigenous identity. And so, the work began. Some schools have been turned into museums or healing centers. Memorials have risen on school grounds and city squares. Orange Shirt Day, every September 30th, now serves as a national day of remembrance, symbolizing the resilience of survivors and the lives of children taken too soon. But gestures must be backed by systemic change. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued 94 calls to action in 2015. As of today, less than half have been fully implemented. Funding promised for Indigenous healthcare, education, clean water, remains delayed or incomplete. Indigenous languages, once forbidden in residential schools, still struggle for recognition and support. And many survivors, now elderly, are still fighting for basic compensation and justice. But reconciliation is not just the government's job. It belongs to every Canadian. It's in the stories we teach our children, in the books on school shelves, in the way we listen to Indigenous voices, not just when tragedy strikes, but every day. It's in acknowledging that the pain of the past is still shaping the present, in poverty rates, in child welfare systems, in the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in prisons and foster care. And it's in remembering that healing is not linear. For some survivors, sharing their story brought closure. For others, it opened old wounds. But through their bravery, a nation was forced to look inward, forced to confront not only what happened, but why it was allowed to happen. Because residential schools were not a secret. They operated in plain sight, funded by governments, run by churches, supported by policies that declared one culture superior and another disposable. The children were not forgotten by accident. They were forgotten by design. But today, their names are being remembered, their stories told, their families honored. The truth hurts, but it's necessary, because reconciliation without truth is just denial with better PR. And so, the final chapter is still being written, not in this documentary, but in homes, schools, courtrooms, and communities across Canada. The question isn't, can we reconcile? It's, will we do the work? And the answer will define a nation's future, not just its past. Because when a country chooses to remember, it chooses to grow. and when it listens to the voices it once tried to silence, it begins, finally, to heal.